Welcome to Edison Open House Global Healthcare 2021. Now, in this session, we're going to be talking to leading buy-side experts, both in the US and Europe, getting their perspective on investing across therapeutic areas and the major markets, and what global investment trends to focus on for 2021. So let me introduce my very splendid panel to you. First of all, hello, Brad Loncar. Hello, Brad. Now, Brad is a well-known independent biotech investor and talking head. That always seems a bit unfair, talking head, but it means he's very sought after, ladies and gentlemen, who's best known for the creation of 2 NASDAQ-listed exchange-traded funds, or precision indices, that offer the investors the opportunity to leverage Brad's extensive knowledge of oncology and specifically immunotherapy, and the emerging powerhouse of Chinese biopharmaceuticals. Now let me introduce veteran healthcare investor. Now it says veteran here. Now veteran usually means older. I usually mean by veteran experienced, highly experienced. Matthias Fehr is that thing, a highly experienced healthcare investor, and he's head of private equity at an established Swiss healthcare specialist fund, and he also happens to be a senior sell-side analyst and scientist at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. Sits on the board of numerous European companies. And finally, Fred Zaino. Fred is founder and chief investment officer of Keystone Capital Partners, a family office based in New York. He spent 15 years at Millennium Management, and Fred established Keystone with his investment partner to provide reliable capital sources and help overlooked and underfunded biotech and medtech companies reach their goal. You are so welcome. So let's start off with perhaps the biggest elephant in the room of all, COVID. We've all been concentrating so hard on COVID, but I wonder what we've missed. So, Brad, let's start with you.
Yeah, you know, it's amazing. One, I guess you could say, silver lining to this tragic year that we had last year is that biotech really went mainstream. Our industry was on the front page of every newspaper, so to speak. And people started to learn about some of these technologies that as biotech investors, we've known for a long time, but the general public doesn't necessarily see them. You know, you see a Tesla driving down the street, or you might use a social media app, but you don't necessarily see these amazing biotech technologies. So for example, last year, mRNA became a household name. Everyone saw how quickly those vaccines made it into clinical trials and how amazing their efficacy was. And so what I would say is the biggest thing that we missed last year is there's a lot of other game-changing technologies that we know as biotech investors, but not everyone knows yet. So I focus on immunotherapy, using the immune system to treat cancer. There's gene editing and gene therapy. You know, there's a gene therapy on the market in the United States that literally helps people with a type of blindness see. I mean, that's amazing. It almost sounds like science fiction. And so what I would say that maybe not biotech investors missed, but what the general public hasn't yet seen is the progress that some of these technologies are making. And so I think as biotech, you know, is a little more mainstream now, maybe the public will hear about those because they all made great progress last year. But as your question implies, because they weren't necessarily COVID related, you didn't necessarily hear about them. But one day you will, because these things are going to change the world.
Matthias, what did you think we all missed?
Well, it was, I thought I missed a lot during that year because it was such a busy year. And, you know, there was so much going on in our sector. I think we just were overwhelmed by the kind of dynamics that was happening last year in biotech. And so what we might have missed is that what we saw last year was just a consequence of a development of an industry that has happened over, I would say, 20 years and has accelerated a lot in the last 5 years. You know, there was, as Brett said, there were a lot of new technologies that finally became mainstream. Gene therapy was mentioned, gene editing, mRNA, targeted therapies in oncology, also in diagnostics and generally in technologies that lead to discovery. A lot of progress happened, and that was reflected in the success of what we've seen as peaking in the last year in the event, in a lot of IPOs that happened and crossovers and a lot of money that went into the sector. So it's not just I would say it's just not the money flow that happened, but it was the overall success of an industry that came forward last year. Really.
Fred, I mean, it was messenger RNA's year, wasn't it?
We kind of don't, or I don't really focus, on the past. We're trying to look forward and see, as crazy as it sounds, what kind of opportunities does this pandemic create for us? Due to the lockdowns, mental health disorder, addiction problems is almost becoming a second pandemic. Alcohol consumption, for instance, has gone up significantly to the point there is an urgent need for public health and medical responses to address this underlying issue. And, in the UK, high-risk drinking levels have gone up 75%. In the US, drinking among women has gone up 41%. So it's kind of being reported all over the place. And, we're looking to make investments in that space.
So very interesting. It's what COVID exposed, really, that leads to the future. And there are some things that COVID has changed undoubtedly forever. And I wondered, I mean, the focus on mental health, I think, was very, very marked and absolutely here to stay. But I wonder if also that whole regulatory piece, because now we've seen that the regulators can move really fast when they want to, whether that genie is going to go back in the box. What do you think, Matthias?
Yeah, it was really an exceptional year for regulators. I think they had a lot of work. It was must have been extremely intensive. With a lot of, there were not only the vaccine applications, the emergency use authorizations, but there were a lot of diagnostics that need to be waved through and other treatments that were requested to get to the market faster. I think it's, one should not expect that this is going to be the normal regulatory process in the future. Definitely not. That will not be responsible in a normal scenario. So I think regulatory authorities will go back to normal for the general drug applications. And there are many processes in place for unmet medical needs, particularly very high and orphan diseases like breakthrough designations and fast track designations and orphan disease status, etc. And actually, the regulatory authorities have made huge progress in terms of accelerating this process over the last years. And I think we go back to the normal once this COVID crisis is over. But it was a good test to see, and it was actually very positive to see how well that worked.
Is there any going back to normal, Fred?
Look, I think the FDA is approving things at the most rapid rate that they've ever done, even outside of COVID. I think the discussion should kind of shift about how can government continue to enable more rapid development, an active role instead of a passive role. Coming out of COVID, I think, the innovation under COVID, it's just leapt forward. Things like remote clinical trials, regulators, they hadn't embraced that until they've had to. So I think it's more, how can the government continue to empower these companies to develop things as quickly as possible without, risking public health safety.
So it was an exceptional year for many companies in the life sciences space. I mean, extraordinarily successful for them. And some companies did particularly well because either they were able to pivot to COVID because, for instance, they were in the diagnostic space, or they happened to be in the right place at the right time. I mean, one of the companies that we looked at for Edison Open House was Oxford Biomedica, who just happens to have got, their facilities absolutely ready at the right time for the manufacture of the AstraZeneca vaccine. But for some companies that have pivoted to COVID, it's going to be quite difficult afterwards. And how do you all view those companies and the investing in them that have gone in so heavily into COVID? Brad, let's talk to you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, earlier you asked, was last year all about messenger RNA? You know, those are great companies, Moderna and BioNTech, to talk about, because for all of the companies that have pivoted to COVID and succeeded, after this is over, they have very lofty expectations to live up to. So Moderna's valuation is over 50 billion, BioNTech's is over 20 billion. And what's been baked into that is that mRNA is going to revolutionize vaccine development, but also other areas of medicine. Those companies are working on things like cancer and rare diseases. And so given from a purely stock market perspective, the expectations for those types of companies, some of the service providers, like you mentioned with Oxford, you know, our industry, now that we have been in the spotlight, like we have been over the last year, and valuations are high, we've got a lot to live up to. And to your question about, will regulatory things change? You know, I sure hope so. I hope the days of it taking 4 or 5 years for a vaccine to come about to be in the past. And I think to live up to our expectations, because, you know, investors don't always have the longest time horizons, you know, sometimes like they should. These companies really have to get into gear and start leveraging these technologies to these other uses that we're hoping they'll work for. And so I think that the next, you know, 2 years or so are going to be really pivotal for these companies and our industry as a whole, because we've got the spotlight on us right now. And, you know, science is difficult, and a lot of success in science is being baked into these companies. And so let's hope that our industry can pull through and that we can live up to all of this.
Fred, you were nodding madly there.
Yeah, no, I think I agree. I think expectations are very high for these COVID-related companies, and you know, they're really going to have to perform next year.
But they've had the most amazing spotlight on their technologies, and
Yeah.
and actually, when I said it was mRNA's year, but you know, the potential for that is extraordinary.
Yeah, I agree.
Matthias.
Yeah, I agree. You know, I mean, on the other hand, you know, the vaccine companies, particularly, I think, you know, the vaccines are going to here to stay. I don't think it's just 2021. We'll see next generation vaccines for COVID. Who knows what will happen with COVID? You know, if this becomes more a seasonal or a regular vaccination, we need repeated vaccines, and we can use this mRNA in other vaccine programs like seasonal flu or combination vaccines, etc. So I think in that. With regards to that, you know, companies like Moderna and BioNTech are now very well placed and have an advantage compared to others in terms of their speed of development. And so I think they, you know, obviously the valuation has a lot of it priced in, and we need to see if mRNA how well and how fast it can work as a therapeutic. But so far it was mainly, I mean, the success was as a vaccine. And other companies, you know, it's really case by case. You know, the treatment companies probably will have a more difficult life going forward. If diagnostics, you know, it led to some transformation of diagnostics companies, and they were able to build a new business model. For them, it might also be challenging, but also diagnostics will continue for quite a while in COVID, because the virus will not be gone even if you have vaccinated 50, 60, 70% of the people.
And it still seems that there's some room for improved diagnostics, because we still have not yet got a perfect diagnostic by any manner of means for COVID. Another problem there was I wondered if there were companies that would emerge that innovated to deal with some of the problems presented by COVID to companies in the life sciences sector. For instance, the huge pressure on supply chains, and also the pressure on availability of reagents, which has actually become a problem that's simply not been apparent before. Brad, a lot of those reagents tend to come from China. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is a geographical problem that's going to spur investment in biotech throughout the entire world. It's not just shortages. You know, you saw countries when we were at kind of the darkest moment with like PPE, do protectionism and everything. And one thing that COVID has shown everyone is how integral our sector is to the normal functioning of society. And I think what you're going to see, and you've already started to see some isolated cases of this, is governments around the world are going to be investing in biotech and are going to be investing in local companies and making sure you have, local manufacturing and things like that. There was a famous case, CureVac is actually another mRNA company, and the German government actually infused it with cash, and they IPO'd, and they've really become more of a German company, so to speak, over the last 6 months, because biotech now is about national security. And I think we have to be very careful about this, because science is all about collaborating and sharing. So you don't want nations to go too far in terms of protectionism. But I think one benefit of this is that you're going to see a real boom of biotech investing all around the world, in the UK, in Europe. We're seeing it in Asia, in China. And so I think there's really going to be a renaissance of biotech investing over the coming years. And those places, you're right, like a lot of the reagents and things are manufactured in Asia, and specifically China. And you'll definitely see a lot more investment in local manufacturing. Sanofi has a big program with the French and EU governments to start manufacturing APIs in the European Union. You'll see a lot more things like that, because we've realized that biotech is a national security interest for countries around the world, and they'll start making those local investments, I think, so that they're better prepared for the next emergency.
I wanted to move to the kind of investment themes that you're all focused on for the coming themes. And Fred, you've already mentioned that mental health is going to be one of the areas that you're looking to. What else, Fred, are you looking at?
Mental health, addiction, but our underlying theme never really changes. We're focused on small, mid-cap, private companies that are often overlooked by others. And, we try and find undervalued ones, disconnects between market perception and reality, pricing inefficiencies, and just trying to find when we identify those opportunities, just trying to determine are the management the right group of people to help deliver the value, execute on the milestones they've set for themselves. So, we're sector agnostic. We're really just looking for, deep value names where the risk reward is skewed heavily in our favor.
Matthias, any particular themes for you?
Yeah, also here I have to disappoint you. We have really a very opportunistic approach, and with a strong fundamental bottom-up view. So we look for innovation, attractive assets that can, really meet unmet medical needs in biopharma. And so that's what we do on the private equity side. We look of big markets also, and strong management teams, and we have pretty much a long-term view on these companies. So we back them for years, even if there's no IPO, and really want to see the value creation until they show the results.
Brad, it's very interesting the way that Matthias and Fred are talking about this, because sometimes innovation doesn't necessarily go with market size. I mean, some of the greatest innovation that we've seen has been in the rare disease space, for instance. But that's not a huge market. Rare diseases, by the very definition, are rare. There isn't a big market, even if there might be a bigger price tag. So where are you thinking of in terms of investment themes?
Yeah, whenever I talk to somebody that's brand new to our sector, the first thing I always say is invest in those things that will have the biggest impact on patients' lives. I mean, it sounds basic, but that's ultimately what we're here for. So rare diseases is a good example of that. You may have diseases where there's only a handful of patients, but in many cases, these are terrible things, and the treatment is really life-saving or life-changing, and that could be very valuable. What you want to avoid are the incremental things. The things that like payers are pushing back the hardest on are things like diabetes and insulins, because new insulins come out, but they're very incremental. They're not really changing patients' lives like some of these other things are. So as an investor, I'm really focusing on new technologies that I think can be game changing for patients. I mentioned gene therapy. There's literally hundreds of genetic based diseases that are terrible diseases that like if your genome, which is the instruction manual that kind of says who you are, if that's like a book, like sometimes terrible diseases are caused by one word on one page being wrong, and companies now have technologies where they can essentially fix that. And already that there are some of those on the market. I mentioned there's a type of blindness in the US that there's a gene therapy for that literally helps people see. These technologies are now being harnessed for things like sickle cell disease and beta thalassemia and other blood disorders. Hemophilia, I think, is going to be revolutionized by this. So as an investor, I'm looking for those things like gene therapy and gene editing that are platform type technologies that are not just about one type of disease, but may have a lot of uses. And so all of that comes down to genomics. Sequencing companies have a role to play in all of that. So anything that's genomics related, I think, is really interesting. And then it's kind of like another long-term trend. I'm very interested in China. The 15-second description of that is China didn't have a biotech sector up until today, and they're in the process of creating one, and there's a biotech boom. And just like China has eventually become a global competitor in other industries, like the technology industry, China is going to have a major biotech sector that's not just about developing and selling drugs in China. There's going to be a Chinese Amgen and Genentech and Celgene that will become household names like Alibaba and Tencent are. That's another mega theme that I'm watching very closely. So I'd say I'm half focused on some of these new emerging technologies. RNAi is another one, immunotherapy and cancer, some of these targeted therapies, what we call precision medicine. Those are the things that are really having the biggest impact on patients' lives. And then from a demographics standpoint, I'm also very interested in what's happening in China today.
And what's interesting is that Chinese companies in the biotech sector, I think they sometimes have have a very undeserved reputation, perhaps not being at the top of their game. But actually, they're recruiting people back. A lot of people who went to the US, studied in the US, and then went back to China. And those companies, they are producing some absolutely top quality products and technologies. I mean, really fine. And the vaccines are perhaps a rather good example of that, where one of the Chinese vaccines is, one of the only two that has a neutralizing antibody effect. So, they can get tarnished with a brush that is not fair.
Absolutely. In fact, you're starting to see Western multinational companies in-license Chinese science, which would have been unheard of just as recently as a few years ago. So AbbVie, for example, last year in-licensed a CD47 inhibitor from a company called IMAB. It may be a best-in-class CD47 inhibitor. You're starting to see those types of deals, and you're right. It's a total new era. In the past, China was almost exclusively a generics drug market, and so there was very little R&D and new inventions happening there. But as you described, you have entrepreneurs who've worked in biotech in the West coming home and starting companies that are doing world-class science. And this is just the very beginning. And there's a big stock market component to this too. It used to be that the stock exchanges in China, like Hong Kong, wouldn't allow biotech companies to list there because they required certain levels of revenue and profit. And now they've made an exception for biotech, and there's an IPO boom. A statistic that people might be shocked to hear, like I even mentioned this to professional life sciences investors, and even like pros in our industry sometimes are surprised to hear this. In terms of dollar amount raised, 9 of the 10 largest biotech IPOs in 2020 were in Hong Kong. Only 1 was in New York. That's really an amazing statistic that deserves a closer look if you don't know about this yet, because I think it's one of the most, if not the most important trends that's going to impact our industry over the coming years, because China itself is such a huge market, but also these are going to be global competitors one day, and we're already starting to see the beginnings of that.
Matthias, I've been interviewing a lot of CEOs of life sciences companies over the course of the Edison Open House. And I'm very struck by the difference in the way that CEOs present their companies. From your point of view, what really attracts you to a company in terms of the way that they are presented by their CEO?
The presentation of a CEO is, I think it's the first impression is very important, and at the end it's a very personal thing. How they come over as a team, and how they present. I look a lot for transparency and direct communication, going into the facts from the beginning. Obviously, I don't like too much, speaking about the markets or valuation or bringing, successful competitors up and spending like 20 minutes on that kind of angle. So if they can go directly into the data in what they do in the strategy and their ideas, and then also showing their team, that's a good start. But at the end, it's a lot is about, I think, at least half is the assets they're representing and developing, and then but the team, we have seen that we're doing this since 20 years, and the value of the team and the way they operate and the experience they have and the track record is extremely important to the success of a biotech company.
Fred, what are your pet hates when you're going to see a team? What really turns you off?
For me, I just want honesty. I'd like to get right to the data. I want to understand the path to market and how big that market is, and how ultimately, do you get off that treadmill of, raising money and how do you get to profitability? I mean, that's the most important thing for me.
Brad?
Yeah, I mean, just like every other industry, the people really matter. That's super important in biotech, like it is in everything else. So I manage a small family office also, and the first thing I always think when I see a CEO present is, am I willing to give my family's money to this, to this person? Are they trustworthy? Are they transparent? All of those things are very important. It's important, look for hype. If you see somebody, science is difficult, and usually the most successful people in our industry are the most humble, because if you really understand biology and science, you appreciate how difficult it is. And so if somebody is telling you they've got a technology that's going to cure Alzheimer's or cure a type of cancer or do all of this wonderful things, that's actually usually a red flag. So the first thing I look for when I'm evaluating a biotech investment is the people, because if that's not good, it's not even worth spending your time looking at all of the other things. But a very close second to that, of course, is science. at the end of the day, you're investing in whether science is going to succeed or not. And if you're picking individual stocks, you have to have some expertise in what you're investing in, because biology is very complicated and difficult. So I put the people first. And another thing that's, I would say, is really important to look for, biotech is very catalyst driven. And one thing that's great is, like, especially at the beginning of the year, around the time we're in now, biotech companies will lay out their catalysts. They'll say, these are the things we expect. This trial will read out. This this meeting with the FDA will happen. And the great thing is, you can, before you invest in a company, what I always recommend is follow a company's progress and see which ones are actually like walking the walk and achieving the catalysts that they're laying out. If a company, has a history of laying out certain catalysts throughout the year and not meeting any of them, then those are the companies you want to avoid. So you don't have to, if you're new to the sector, you definitely don't have to dive into a company right away. What I would say is start following the story, start following their progress, start, following their promises, and see which ones actually follow through and are reliable. And over time, companies build reputations like that. And the very last thing I'll say is, getting back to the people, it's important to have experience in this industry. Like, you see very few young CEOs in biotech like you see in tech. And the reason for that is this is the most highly regulated sector there is. And it's hard to succeed in developing something that makes it through and gets approved by the FDA. That's really difficult. And you kind of have to have experience of going through that and working yourself up the ranks and seeing how the process works. And so another thing that's very common in our industry is there are successful serial entrepreneurs who have started companies, successfully developed drugs, and then sold those drugs. Experience matters. And right now there's a big biotech boom, and there's more biotech companies than ever. And I think some of the management team experience is a little thin just because there's so much competition. So I would also look at people's backgrounds and see who's succeeded or who has been in this industry in successful situations in the past. I think that's important as well.
Now, Fred and Brad, you've both mentioned hype. And I wonder, actually, in biotech, are we seeing a bit of a bubble? Matthias, what do you think? I mean, particularly I'm thinking about the gene therapy companies, the stock's just soaring. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, there was a big capital inflow, coming into our sector. And, sometimes it happens then that, every stock goes up, there's like a tsunami of money coming in. And then, we saw generally the assets under management of the institutional biotech funds, they have increased multifold overall. And then there's retail coming in as well, investing. And then obviously, there are bubbles here and there. And we might see, I think, we might see some corrections selectively on certain names. But generally, I don't see a huge bubble that the whole market is totally flawed, or there's really a risk of a major correction. There's just too many positive things ongoing in this market. But I agree, valuations are always always affect, a consequence of supply and demand. And currently there's a lot of demand for stocks. There's also a lot of supply. We have seen it is a record year for IPOs, for crossovers, for venture deals. And at the end, the more companies that are coming out and raising funds, maybe the more the average quality goes a bit down, because the more is being funded that maybe wouldn't have been funded in a more capital restricted market. So from that point of view, there's always, if this goes on for too long, there's always selective corrections. There's a separation of the wheat from the staff over time happening, and I hope we're not really in a real bubble market, and I think probably not. And so in that sense, the answer is yes and no. But I'm there's a lot of fundamental positive things behind biotech, and the reason why all these companies develop that way. And also not to forget, that the capital can make a lot of a difference. You know, when I look back in 2005 or 2010, capital was rare and the companies had to struggle to raise funds. They could never move with the kind of speed they can now. The technologies are different, timelines are, you know, there's a justification for a higher valuation. And we see that pharma pays for these valuations. You know, M&A, a lot of important deals have happened last year that confirm somehow these valuations. So pharma is ready to pay for that, the same that is currently being paid by the investors buying these stocks.
Fred, are you seeing bubbles anywhere in the market?
You know, it's tough to say. Look, I think there's, you know, I agree. There's been access to capital. It's readily available, even for some of the lower tier kind of companies out there. So it's, you know, I think that could present a problem later on. And I think some of the companies are just way ahead of themselves, the lower tier. It seems that anyone that wants to raise capital has the ability to raise, you know, any amount that they want, pretty much. And
certainly this sector is attracting a lot of retail investments. Do you think that's true, Brad?
Yeah, I do think there's some bubbles per se, especially in the US market. You know, I'm in the ETF business. There's
ETF.
A very successful genomics.
Sorry, I just stopped you. ETF, just explain.
Oh yeah, so an ETF, that stands for exchange traded funds. So an ETF is like a mutual fund. It's like a basket of stocks. But the difference is it trades on the stock exchange. So like it's a way to invest in like a diversified way in something, but it looks just like a stock and it trades on the stock exchange. There's a genomics themed biotech ETF that's brought in $10 billion of assets over the last few months of 2020. And I think it has created a bubble in genomics type stocks, most specifically like CRISPR companies. So CRISPR is a gene editing tool. There's a company called CRISPR Therapeutics that's a great company that has game-changing science. Like I believe in the science, but this is a company that is currently very early in its journey and has a $15 billion valuation. There's another company called Beam that does a type of CRISPR editing that hasn't even started its first clinical trial and won't for another year, that already has a $6 billion valuation. So I think that a lot of people are hearing these terms like CRISPR and are hearing that, you know, they're going to cure every disease out there. And maybe that'll be true over like 30 or 40 years, but it's not going to be true over 6 months. Science takes a long time. And so the promise of those types of companies is very strong and is actually rooted in very strong fundamental science. But at the end of the day, companies have pipelines. And you have to think about, you know, when will these companies actually have therapies on the market and what type of revenue will those potentially bring in one day? And that type of math is not being done by, you know, retail investors who are either, you know, throwing money at ETFs or throwing money at these individual companies. And so I do worry, you know, I kind of hate using the word bubble because, again, these are good things that are rooted in good science. It's not like a mirage that I think will blow up and go away. Far from it. But at the end of the day, you know, the valuation of anything can get too high. And I think in certain areas of biotech, especially in the US stock market, especially in this like quote unquote genomic space and like the CRISPR type companies, I do think valuations have gotten crazy just based off of the money that's flowing into these companies. And I do think there's going to be, you know, pretty painful correction, you know, at some point. It's always, you know, bubbles are hard to predict. Like it could literally, you know, deflate tomorrow morning or it could go on for another 6 months. But I don't think the valuations match up very well with the current fundamentals of these companies. And so I'm personally very careful about those.
Yeah, we should never forget the history of both monoclonal antibodies and indeed of gene therapy, version 1, both of which kind of bombed and then had to claw their way painfully back again after a huge amount of hype. Talking about huge amount of hype, and this is where Matthias and I sit on the sidelines, and is post-Trump and the Biden administration. We've seen some fairly febrile activity in the States recently, a flurry of last-minute Trump orders, and I haven't quite worked out which ones have been already rescinded by Biden. I think there's one on AI regulation. I think there were some others relating to pharmaceuticals. But how is this sector going to fare in the Biden days? So I'm looking at you two Americans right now. So Fred, Fred.
Trump had, Operation Warp Speed for the COVID. Back in 2015, Biden, he had a program, or Obama and him instituted a program, the Cancer Moonshot 2020 program.
Yeah.
I'd love to see something like that. And, earlier we talked about how it has to be, and I think Brad mentioned it has to be a collaboration. That's what that Cancer Moonshot was. It was a collaboration of pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies, the payers, community oncologists, academia, all working together to accelerate the development of immunotherapies, targeted therapies. And I think the ultimate goal there was to get to a point where you're managing cancer in a way that you might manage any other chronic disease like diabetes or asthma. So, I'd love to see something like that where, there's a big collaboration with everyone and try and push it forward, accelerate things.
Brad.
Yeah, I think this is a little bit of a blind spot for investors right now. So first of all, I'm a big fan of President Biden, and I really respect the work that he did for the Cancer Moonshot. I'm glad you brought that up, Fred. So, I think he's a great person who really understands our sector. He spoke, when he was vice president, he spoke at a cancer conference called AACR one year, and that's something that you would never see a politician of that stature, personally attend and speak at. So that's amazing. But I think everyone is so, the changing of an administration is a big deal. And everyone's so focused on COVID right now, we're forgetting that this could have a transformational effect, outside of COVID on our industry. And, drug pricing is always going to be the number one fundamental issue for our industry. And I think that everyone has kind of thought for some reason that the new administration is going to be so focused on COVID that they're going to forget about that. I've got news for you. They aren't. And one thing that I'm watching closely, I don't know if this will happen or not, but I'm the type of investor, I always think like what bad could happen. With Democrats kind of running the House, like doing so well in the latest election and also controlling Congress, you have to watch for in politics always you have to watch for like the fringe ends of each political party. And on the progressive side of the Democrat Party, there's a lot of really, in the past, people have brought up some really far out ideas that might affect our sector. And the term that I would put on everyone's radar is something called march-in rights. This is something that's not an issue today, but I think could be a big issue this coming year. So what march-in rights is if the US government in some way has contributed to research for a certain technology, it technically has the legal power to kind of cancel the IP out of a drug and allow any other company to start manufacturing it.
I can see that would be popular.
Yeah, well, and the thing I worry about is at the end of the last Democratic administration, so President Obama, some Democratic senators called for using march-in rights on some pretty mainstream drugs, like Bernie Sanders did that with a prostate cancer drug called Xtandi. It never went through, but this is very important because IP is the lifeblood of our sector. If you don't have IP, you don't have a biotech sector. And whenever this term margin rates is usually brought up, who's ever proposing it will say, oh, this is for a very specific situation, an HIV drug that, won't affect anything else. But my feeling as an investor is if you cancel out the IP on one drug, then you lose confidence in the IP of all others. And so I would just know about this term margin rates because I wouldn't be surprised to see it come up this year. And if something like that goes through, which I guess would be theoretically possible when you have one party that controls so much power, that's the type of thing that could be like a black swan event that would have a negative impact on our sector. So it's something that I'm watching for very closely to see if that becomes a word in the headlines. Something like that could be a negative, political aspect of our industry with the new administration. So it bears watching, I think.
And let's not forget that America is the #1 domino in the domino chain that extends right across the world in terms of pharmaceutical pricing.
Yeah.
We have got Biogen's aducanumab for Alzheimer's, which is said to be the key catalyst in 2021. And a lot of people are focusing on that. Matthias, what do you think the chances are for the approval of that program? And what do you think it might mean for the whole sector?
I wouldn't like to speculate because I didn't, I'm really focusing on earlier stage companies, and I've observed what's happened. I read some secondary research, and it's hard to judge, but I would rather leave it to someone else who has spent really detailed time on it. But obviously, I don't think it has an important read through for the sector at all. I think the data, as far as I understand, is not clear. It's not a statistically significant endpoint, a primary endpoint that was reached in according to FDA regulations. So everybody's aware that this is not a clear-cut decision, and if it happens or not happens, obviously, if it would be approved, that could be a major positive for the sector, because it would clearly signal that the FDA is open to approve things with a high unmet medical need, products with a high unmet medical need, which have maybe a bit borderline data, but maybe a tendency towards efficacy.
Fred, though, it speaks to some of the things that perhaps you've been interested in, because if these big Alzheimer's drugs are to succeed, you really need to detect the disease early. I mean, long before there are any symptoms. And actually, that goes back to diagnostic, that goes back to some of the companion diagnostics and biomarkers. So some of those areas in actually perhaps much smaller companies could be stimulated if there's an approval in the sphere, because it means ideally people want to push back in the time at which the drug is first given. Is that a possibility, do you think?
I'm not, I don't follow Biogen. It's a little bit out of my wheelhouse, but at the end of the day, I think an approval and a positive outcome of that trial would be great for patients. And I do think, diagnostics, people do want to treat earlier and earlier. The earlier you catch a disease, the more likely you are to be able to, cure it or curb the negative effects it might have.
Brad, do you follow this market?
Yeah, so I'll actually play devil's advocate on this one. I would argue that it would be a bad thing if this drug is approved. So in my opinion, I'm not an Alzheimer's or a CNS expert, but I think the data on this one is particularly thin. And before this approval decision, the FDA convened a committee of experts to talk about this drug and to vote on how they feel about it. Their vote is non-binding, but it gives us a sense of what physicians and other researchers think of it. And they voted it down in just about the hardest terms possible. And while, our Alzheimer's is, arguably the biggest problem we have in society. Our hearts go out, to all patients, and all of us want a good treatment as quickly as possible, of course. But I think that one of the reasons why the US has such a great biotech sector is the fact that our FDA is the gold standard. And I view this as such, thin evidence, especially after a vote of experts like that, that if FDA did approve this, in my opinion, it would really, I think, tarnish the gold standard seal of the FDA. And so, I'm all for efficient regulation and speeding things up and accelerated approvals and doing everything you can to approve more drugs as quickly as possible. But you can go too far sometimes and things like that. And in this case, I just don't see the evidence being there. And so I actually think it might be a bad thing for the industry as a whole, because it would say something about the scientific standards of the FDA. And we just went through a really rough 4 or 5 months for the FDA, where it was talked about from a political standpoint, unlike it ever has before. And I think more than ever, it's important for the FDA to be viewed as the highest standard scientific, organization that it can be. And so I think that now is probably not the best time for a drug approval like that, even though Alzheimer's truly is the biggest unmet need out there. So we'll see what happens. But without a doubt, no matter what happens, yes or no, that's as big of an event as you get in our industry, and everybody's watching it, and it will have ramifications. So we're all anticipating the news.
Well, talking about big events and what we missed in 2020, one of them was certainly JP Morgan. And it's interesting. I mean, I don't know whether you can connect these two things, but JP Morgan went virtual this year, and we didn't see a lot of M&As in the news cycle this month. Are the two connected? Fred?
Maybe, I don't know, maybe it's the lack of face-to-face. I think a lot of the deals being done is always face-to-face, but look, there's been access to capital. It's for any tier company has that access to capital to fund their own programs. It might speak to valuations out there where an acquirer might not view a target that attractive because of the market capitalization. So, it's tough to say. There are a lot of factors there. So, I'm not sure.
I'll get back in my box. Conspiracy theory too far, right? On that, I want to close with some thoughts from each of you about some stocks or perhaps some sectors that you'll be watching particularly in 2021. Let's start with you, Matthias.
Yeah, I mean, I won't give you names, but we look at I would really look at oncology companies that are in later stage development, that are coming out with data, and nowadays data means already, sometimes it's phase 1B or phase 2A that are potentially could be very positive. So one can either buy them before or look at it once the data comes out. There's I would really look for the large indications also, but also at orphan diseases, but which are in development. I would maybe be cautious, as said, with stocks at the too early stage companies that have run too far in the current environment. Really look for data. We have a lot of these companies in our portfolio, so I wouldn't like to favor one child over the other. So it's there's a lot of news flow happening. There's also some M&A. You can also look for companies who would fit or be good candidates to be taken out. They're usually doing very well. Obviously, not all of them are taken out, but we've seen a lot of M&A activities last year. And I think the fact that maybe during JP Morgan not a lot was announced was also maybe just because there was not so much PR pressure to really sign a deal around JP Morgan, and might just happen now a few weeks later.
Fred, what about you?
Again, we're agnostic as far as companies are concerned. We're really looking for, skewing that risk reward heavily in our favor, giving ourselves a lot of upside and little downside. We're going to be spending a lot spending a lot of time in the area, the mental health area, precision oncology and diagnostics are some of the ones that we have some larger investments in. So.
And you talked about data, Matthias, and of course, one of the things that we see increasingly is big data and the need to wrangle it. And none of you have mentioned AI yet. Is that a sector, Fred, that you look at with any favor?
It's not something that we currently are looking at, no.
Brad?
Yeah, that's definitely a hot area. There's a company, Schrodinger, that IPO'd last year that's been very successful, and I think others will follow. In terms of what I'm watching for the year ahead, the biggest thing I'm watching is whether that genomics bubble, bursts, and if it does, is it going to affect all of biotech, or will it be confined just to that specific corner of our industry? So I'll be watching that very closely. And then China. It's the top thing on my radar right now because I think it's such an important theme. And I would just say in general that some valuations may be too high. Or, you can talk about things like that, but I think that the next 10 years is going to be biology's decade. And I think that the world was really woken up to that, through this tragic year that we've had with COVID. As biotech investors, we've always known how special some of the science is today and how game-changing it is. So I think just like the microchip, spurred the technology sector over the last couple decades, I think this sector is going to have a major impact on all of society in a positive way. So, maybe some stocks are a little ahead of themselves or something, but this is a great sector to know about. And I think it's going to be a great sector to invest in for many years to come. So I couldn't be more excited about the long-term prospects of this industry than I am today. I just think it's an exciting thing to be in the middle of.
Well, it has been an extraordinary year for biotech. It's been pushed into the spotlight. Who knew that anybody that you stopped on the street would know what an antibody was, would have heard of mRNA without saying what? And I think people have really looked for science to lead them out of the terrible mess that we're in. So perhaps it's not surprising that people have put biotech and the whole life sciences sector onto that pedestal. It is, I think, going to be a very exciting year. I'm enormously grateful to all three of you for giving us your words of wisdom. They may describe you as veteran investors, but to me, you're just people with oodles of experience and lots to tell us and advise us on. Thank you so much for being part of this.
Thank you.
Fred, Brad, goodbye.
Bye.